28. Caesar had long ago resolved to put down Pompeius, as Pompeius also had fully resolved to do towards him. For now that Crassus had lost his life among the Parthians, who kept a watch over both of them, it remained for one of them, in order to be the chief, to put down him who was, and to him who was the chief, to take off the man whom he feared, in order that this might not befall him. But it had only recently occurred to Pompeius to take alarm, and hitherto he had despised Caesar, thinking it would be no difficult thing for the man whom he had elevated to be again depressed by him. But Caesar, who had formed his design from the beginning, like an athlete, removed himself to a distance from his antagonists and exercised himself in the Celtic Wars, and thus disciplined his troops and increased his reputation, being elevated by his exploits to an equality with the victories of Pompeius, also laying hold of pretexts, some furnished by the conduct of Pompeius himself, and others by the times and the disordered state of the administration at Rome, owing to which those who were candidates for magistracies placed tables in public and shamelessly bribed the masses, and the people being hired went down to show their partisanship not with votes on behalf of their briber, but with bows and swords and slings. And after polluting the rostra with blood and dead bodies, they separated, leaving the city to anarchy, like a ship carried along without a pilot, so that sensible men were well content if matters should result in nothing worse than a monarchy after such madness and such tempest. And there were many who even ventured to say publicly that the state of affairs could only be remedied by a monarchy, and that they ought to submit to this remedy when applied by the mildest of physicians, hinting at Pompeius. But when Pompeius, in what he said, affected to decline the honor, though in fact he was more than anything else laboring to bring about his appointment as dictator, Cato, who saw through his intention, persuaded the Senate to appoint him sole consul, that he might not by violent means get himself made dictator, and might be contented with a mere constitutional monarchy. They also decreed an additional period for his provinces, and he had two, Iberia and all Libya, which he administered by sending legatae and maintaining armies, for which he received out of the public treasury 1,000 talents every year. 29. Upon this, Caesar began to canvass for a consulship by sending persons to Rome, and also for the prorogation of the government of his provinces. At first Pompeius kept silent, but Marcellus and Lentulus opposed his claim, for they hated Caesar on other grounds, and they added to what was necessary what was not necessary, to dishonor and insult him. For they deprived of the citizenship the inhabitants of Novum Comum, a colony lately settled by Caesar in Gaul, and Marcellus, who was consul, punished with stripes one of the senators of Novum Comum who had come to Rome, and added to this insult that he put these marks upon him to show that he was not a Roman, and he told him to go and show them to Caesar. After the consulship of Marcellus, when Caesar had now profusely poured forth his Gallic wealth for all those engaged in public life to draw from, and had released Curio, the tribune, from many debts, and given to Paulus the consul 1,500 talents, out of which he decorated the Forum with the Basilica, a famous monument which he built in place of the old one called Fulvia. Under these circumstances, Pompeius, fearing cabal, both openly himself and by means of his friends exerted himself to have a successor appointed to Caesar in his government, and he sent and demanded back of him the soldiers which he had lent to Caesar for the Gallic Wars. Caesar sent the men back, after giving each of them a present of 250 drachmae. The officers who led these troops to Pompeius spread abroad among the people reports about Caesar, which were neither decent nor honest, and they misled Pompeius by ill-founded hopes, telling him that the army of Caesar longed to see him, and that while he with difficulty directed affairs at Rome owing to the odium produced by secret intrigues, the force with Caesar was already ready for him, and that if Caesar's soldiers should only cross over to Italy, they would forthwith be on his side. So hateful, they said, had Caesar become to them on account of his numerous campaigns, and so suspected, owing to their fear of monarchy. With all this, Pompeius was inflated, and he neglected to get soldiers in readiness, as if he were under no apprehension. But by words and resolution, he was overpowering Caesar, as he supposed, by carrying decrees against him, which Caesar cared not for at all. It is even said that one of the centurions who had been sent by him to Rome, while standing in front of the Senate house, on hearing that the Senate would not give Caesar a longer term in his government, "But this," he said, "shall give it," striking the hilt of his sword with his hand. 30. However, the claim of Caesar at least had a striking show of equity, for he proposed that he should lay down his arms, and that when Pompeius had done the same, and both had become private persons, they should get what favors they could from the citizens. And he argued that if they took from him his power, and confirmed to Pompeius what he had, they would be stigmatizing one as a tyrant, and making the other a tyrant in fact. When Curio made this proposal before the people on behalf of Caesar, he was loudly applauded, and some even threw chaplets of flowers upon him, as on a victorious athlete. Antonius, who was tribune, produced to the people a letter of Caesar's on this subject, which he had received, and he read it in spite of the consuls. But in the Senate, Scipio, the father-in-law of Pompeius, made a motion that if Caesar did not lay down his arms on a certain day, he should be declared an enemy. Upon the consuls putting the question whether they were of opinion that Pompeius should dismiss his troops, and again whether Caesar should, very few voted in favor of the former question, and all but a few voted in favor of the latter. But when Antonius on his side moved that both should dismiss their troops, all unanimously were in favor of that opinion. Scipio made a violent opposition, and Lentulus, the consul, called out that they needed arms to oppose a robber and not votes, on which the Senate broke up, and the senators changed their dress as a sign of lamentation on account of the dissension. 31. But when letters had come from Caesar by which he appeared to moderate his demands, for he proposed to surrender everything else except Gaul within the Alps, and Illyricum with 2 legions, which should be given to him to hold till he was a candidate for a second consulship, and Cicero the orator, who had just returned from Cilicia and was laboring at a reconciliation, was inducing Pompeius to relent. And Pompeius was ready to yield in everything else, except as to the soldiers, whom he still insisted on taking from Caesar. Cicero urged the friends of Caesar to give in, and to come to a settlement on the terms of the above-mentioned provinces, and the allowance of 6,000 soldiers only to Caesar. Pompeius was ready to yield and to give way, but the consul Lentulus would not let him, and he went so far as to insult and drive with dishonor from the Senate both Curio and Antonius, thus himself contriving for Caesar the most specious of all pretexts, by the aid of which, indeed, Caesar mainly excited the passions of his men, pointing out to them that men of distinction and magistrates had made their escape in hired vehicles in the dress of slaves. For putting on this guise through fear, they had stolen out of Rome. 32. Now Caesar had about him no more than 300 horse and 5,000 legionary soldiers, for the rest of his army, which had been left beyond the Alps, was to be conducted by those whom he sent for that purpose. Seeing that the commencement of his undertaking and the onset did not so much require a large force at the present, but were to be effected by the alarm which a bold stroke would create, and by quickly seizing his opportunity, for he concluded that he should strike terror by his unexpected movement more easily than he could overpower his enemies by attacking them with all his force. He ordered his superior officers and centurions, with their swords alone, and without any other weapons, to take Arminum, a large city of Gaul, avoiding all bloodshed and confusion as much as possible. And he entrusted the force to Hortensius. Caesar himself passed the day in public, standing by some gladiators who were exercising and looking on. And a little before evening, after attending to his person and going into the mess room and staying a while with those who were invited to supper, just as it was growing dark, he rose, and courteously addressing the guests, told them to wait for his return. But he had previously given notice to a few of his friends to follow him, not all by the same route, but by different directions. Mounting one of the hired vehicles, he drove at first along another road, and then, turning towards Arminium, when he came to the stream which divides Gaul within the Alps from the rest of Italy, it is called Rubicon, and he began to calculate as he approached nearer to the danger, and was agitated by the magnitude of the hazard, he checked his speed. And halting, he considered about many things with himself in silence, his mind moving from one side to the other, and his will then underwent many changes. And he also discussed at length with his friends who were present, of whom Pollio Asinius was one, all the difficulties, and enumerated the evils which would ensue to all mankind from his passage of the river, and how great a report of it they would leave to posterity. At last, with a kind of passion, as if he were throwing himself out of reflection into the future, and uttering what is the usual expression with which men preface their entry upon desperate enterprises, and daring, "Let the die be cast," he hurried to cross the river. And thence advancing at full speed, he attacked Arminum before daybreak and took it. It is said that on the night before the passage of the river, he had an impure dream, for he dreamed that he was in unlawful commerce with his mother. 33. But when Arminum was taken, as if the war had been let loose through wide gates over all the earth and sea at once, and the laws of the state were confounded together with the limits of the province, one would not have supposed that men and women only, as on other occasions, in alarm were hurrying through Italy, but that the cities themselves, rising from their foundations, were rushing in flight, one through another. And Rome herself, as if she were deluged by torrents, owing to the crowding of the people from the neighboring towns and their removal, could neither easily be pacified by magistrate, nor kept in order by words. And in the midst of the mighty swell and the tossing of the tempest, narrowly escaped being overturned by her own agitation. For contending emotions and violent movements occupied every place. Neither did those who rejoiced keep quiet, but in many places, as one might expect in a large city, coming into collision with those who were alarmed and sorrowing, and being full of confidence as to the future, they fell to wrangling with them. And people from various quarters assailed Pompeius, who was terror-struck, and had to endure the censure of one party for strengthening Caesar against himself and the supremacy of Rome, while others charged him with inciting Lentulus to insult Caesar, who was ready to give way and was proposing fair terms of accommodation. Favonius bade him stamp on the ground with his foot. For Pompeius, on one occasion, in an arrogant address to the Senate, told them not to be concerned or trouble themselves about preparations for war. When Caesar advanced, he would stamp upon the earth with his foot and fill Italy with armies. However, even then Pompeius had the advantage over Caesar in amount of forces, but nobody would let the man follow his own judgment, and giving way to the many false reports and alarms that the war was now close at hand and the enemy in possession of everything, and carried away by the general movement, he declared by an edict that he saw there was tumult, and he left the city after giving his commands to the Senate to follow, and that no one should stay who preferred his country and freedom to tyranny. 34. Accordingly, the consuls fled without even making the sacrifices which it was usual to make before quitting the city. And most of the senators also took to flight, in a manner as if they were robbing, each snatching of his own what first came to hand, as if it belonged to another. There were some also who, though they had hitherto vehemently supported the party of Caesar, through alarm at that time lost their presence of mind, and without any necessity for it, were carried along with the current of that great movement. A most piteous sight was the city, when so great a storm was coming on, left like a ship whose helmsman had given her up, to be carried along and dashed against anything that lay in her way. But though this desertion of the city was so piteous a thing, men for the sake of Pompeius considered the flight to be their country, and they were quitting Rome as if it were the camp of Caesar. For even Labienus, one of Caesar's greatest friends, who had been his legatus and had fought with him most gallantly in all the Gallic Wars, then fled away from Caesar and came to Pompeius. But Caesar sent to Labienus both his property and his baggage, and advancing he pitched his camp close to Domitius, who with 30 cohorts held Corfinium. Domitius, despairing of himself, asked his physician, who was a slave, for poison, and taking what was given he drank it, intending to die. Shortly after, hearing that Caesar showed wonderful clemency towards his prisoners, he bewailed his fate and blamed the rashness of his resolution. But on the physician assuring him that what he had taken was only a sleeping potion and not deadly, he sprung up overjoyed, and going to Caesar, received his right hand, and yet he afterwards went over again to Pompeius. This intelligence being carried to Rome made people more tranquil, and some who had fled returned. 35. Caesar took the troops of Domitius into his service, as well as the soldiers that were raising for Pompeius, whom he surprised in the cities, and having now got a numerous and formidable army, he advanced against Pompeius. Pompeius did not await his approach, but fled to Brundisium, and sending the consuls over before him, with a force to Dyrrachium, himself shortly after sailed from Brundisium upon the approach of Caesar, as will be told more particularly in the life of Pompeius. Though Caesar wished to pursue immediately, he was prevented by want of ships, and he turned back to Rome, having in 60 days without bloodshed become master of Italy. Finding the city more tranquil than he expected, and many of the senators in it, he addressed them in moderate and constitutional language, urging them to send persons to Pompeius with suitable terms of accommodation. But no one listened to his proposal, either because they feared Pompeius, whom they had deserted, or supposed that Caesar did not really mean what he said, and merely used specious words. when the tribune Metellus attempted to prevent him from taking money from the reserved treasury and alleged certain laws, Caesar replied that the same circumstances did not suit arms and laws. But do you, if you don't like what is doing, get out of the way, for war needs not bold words. When we have laid down our arms after coming to terms, then you may come forward and make your speeches to the people. And in saying this, he continued, I waive part of my rights, for you are mine, and all are mine, who have combined against me, now that I have caught them. Having thus spoken to Metellus, he walked to the doors of the treasury. But as the keys were not found, he sent for smiths and ordered them to break the locks. Metellus again opposed him, and some commended him for it. But Caesar, raising his voice, threatened to kill him if he did not stop his opposition. And this, said he, young man, you will know, is more painful for me to have said than to do. These words alarmed Metellus and made him retire, and also caused everything else to be supplied to Caesar for the war without further trouble, and with speed. 36. He marched against Iberia, having first determined to drive out Afranius and Varro, the legatii of Pompeius, and having got into his power the forces in the provinces in those parts, then to advance against Pompeius, without leaving any enemy in his rear. After having often been exposed to risk in his own person from ambuscades, and with his army, chiefly from want of provisions, he never gave up pursuing, challenging to battle, and hemming in the enemy with his lines, till he had made himself master of their camps and forces. The generals escaped to Pompeius. 37. On his return to Rome, Piso, the father-in-law of Caesar, advised that they should send commissioners to Pompeius to treat of terms, but Assaracus opposed the measure to please Caesar. Being chosen dictator by the Senate, he restored the exiles, and the children of those who had suffered in the times of Sulla he reinstated in their civil rights, and he relieved the debtors by a certain abatement of the interest, and took in hand other measures of the like kind, not many in number. But in 11 days he abdicated the monarchy, and declaring himself and Servilius Assaracus consuls, set out on his expedition. The rest of his forces he passed by on his hurried march, and with 600 picked horsemen and 5 legions, the time being the winter solstice and the commencement of January, he put to sea, and crossing the Ionian Gulf, he took Oricum and Apollonia. But he sent back his ships to Brundisium for the soldiers whom he had left behind on his march. But while the men were still on the road, as they were already past the vigor of their age, and worn out by the number of their campaigns, they murmured against Caesar. Whither now will he lead us, and where will this man at last carry us to, hurrying us about, and treating us as if we could never be worn out, and as if we were inanimate things? Even the sword is at last exhausted by blows, and shield and breastplate need to be spared a little after so long use. Even our wounds do not make Caesar consider that he commands perishable bodies, and that we are but mortal towards endurance and pain. And the winter season and the storms of the sea, even a god cannot command. But this man runs all risks, as if he were not pursuing his enemies, but flying from them. With such words as these, they marched slowly towards Brundisium. But when they found that Caesar had embarked, then quickly changing their temper, they reproached themselves as traitors to their imperator, and they abused their officers also for not hastening the march. Sitting on the heights, they looked towards the sea, and towards Epirus for the ships, which were to carry them over to their commander. 38. At Apollonia, as Caesar had not a force sufficient to oppose the enemy, and the delay of the troops from Italy put him in perplexity and much uneasiness, he formed a desperate design, without communicating it to anyone, to embark in a 12-oared boat and go over to Brundisium, though the sea was commanded by so many ships of the enemy. Accordingly, disguising himself in a slave's dress, he went on board by night, and throwing himself down as a person of no importance, he lay quiet. While the river Anius was carrying down the boat towards the sea, the morning breeze, which at that time generally made the water smooth at the outlet of the river by driving the waves before it, was beaten down by a strong wind, which blew all night over the sea. And the river, chafing at the swell of the sea and the opposition of the waves, was becoming rough, being driven back by the huge blows and violent eddies, so that it was impossible for the master of the boat to make head against it. On which he ordered the men to change about, intending to turn the boat around. Caesar, perceiving this, discovered himself, and taking the master by the hand, who was alarmed at the sight of him, said, "Come, my good man, have courage and fear nothing. You carry Caesar and the fortune of Caesar in your boat." The sailors now forgot the storm, and sticking to their oars worked with all their force to get out of the river. But as it was impossible to get on, after taking in much water and running great risk at the mouth of the river, Caesar very unwillingly consented that the master should put back. On his return, the soldiers met him in crowds and blamed him much, and complained that he did not feel confident of victory even with them alone, but was vexed and exposed himself to risk on account of the absent, as if he distrusted those who were present. 39. Shortly after Antonius arrived from Brundisium with the troops, and Caesar, being now confident, offered battle to Pompeius, who was well posted and had sufficient supplies both from land and sea, while Caesar at first had no abundance, and afterwards was hard-pressed for want of provisions. But the soldiers cut up a certain root, and mixing it with milk, ate it. At once, having made loaves of it, they ran up to the enemy's outposts, threw the bread into the camp, and pitched it about, adding that so long as the earth produces such roots, they will never stop besieging Pompeius. Pompeius, however, would not let either the matter of the loaves or these words be made known to the mass of the army, for his soldiers were dispirited, and dreaded the savage temper and endurance of the enemy, as if they were wild beasts. There were continually skirmishes about the fortifications of Pompeius, and Caesar had the advantage in all except one, in which there was a great rout of his troops, and he was in danger of losing his camp. For when Pompeius made an onset, no one stood the attack, but the trenches were filled with the dying, and Caesar's men were falling about their own ramparts and bulwarks, being driven in disorderly flight. Though Caesar met the fugitives and endeavored to turn them, he had no success, and when he laid hold of the colors, those who were carrying them threw them down, so that the enemy took 32, and Caesar himself had a narrow escape with his life. A tall, strong man was running away, passed by Caesar, who put his hand upon him, ordered him to stand and face the enemy. But the man, who was completely confounded by the danger, raised his sword to strike him, on which Caesar's shield-bearer struck the man first and cut off his shoulder. Caesar had so completely given up his cause as lost that when Pompeius, either through caution or from some accident, did not put the finishing stroke to his great success, but retreated after shutting up the fugitives within their ramparts, Caesar said to his friends, as he was retiring, "Today the victory would be with the enemy, if they had a commander who knew how to conquer." Going into his tent and lying down, Caesar spent that night of all nights in the greatest agony and perplexity, considering that his generalship had been bad, in that while a fertile country lay near him and the rich cities of Macedonia and Thessaly, he had neglected to carry the war thither, and was now stationed on the sea, which the enemy commanded with his ships, and that he was rather held in siege by want of supplies than holding the enemy in siege by his arms. Accordingly, after passing a restless night, full of uneasiness at the difficulty and danger of his present position, he broke up his camp, with the determination of leading his troops into Macedonia, to oppose Scipio, for he concluded that either he should draw Pompeius after him to a country where he would fight without the advantage of having the same supplies from the sea, or that he would defeat Scipio if he were left to himself. 40. This encouraged the army of Pompeius and the officers about him to stick close to Caesar, whom they considered to have been defeated and to be making his escape. Though Pompeius himself was cautious about hazarding a battle for so great a stake, and as he was excellently furnished with everything for prolonging the war, he thought it best to wear out and weaken the vigor of the enemy, which could not be long sustained. For the best fighting men in Caesar's army possessed experience and irresistible courage in battle, but in marchings and making encampments and assaulting fortifications and watching by night, they gave way by reason of their age, and their bodies were unwieldy for labor, and owing to weakness had lost their alacrity. It was also reported that a pestilential disease was prevalent in Caesar's army, which had originated in the want of proper food. And what was chief of all, as Caesar was neither well supplied with money nor provisions, it might be expected that in a short time his army would be broken up of itself. 41. For these reasons Pompeius did not wish to fight, and Cato alone commended his design, because he wished to spare the citizens. For after seeing those who had fallen in the battle to the number of 1,000, he wrapped up his face and went away with tears in his eyes. But all the rest abused Pompeius for avoiding a battle, and tried to urge him on by calling him Agamemnon and King of Kings, by which they implied that he was unwilling to lay down the sole command, and was proud at having so many officers under his orders and coming to his tent. Favonius, who aped Cato's freedom of speech, raved because they should not be able, even that year, to enjoy the figs of Tusculum, owing to Pompeius being so fond of command. And Afranius, for he had just arrived from Iberia, where he had shown himself a bad general, being charged with betraying his army for a bribe, asked why they did not fight with a merchant who had bought the provinces of him. Pressed by all this importunity, Pompeius pursued Caesar with the intention of fighting, though contrary to his wish. Caesar accomplished his march with difficulty, as no one would supply him with provisions, and he was universally despised on account of his recent defeat. However, after taking Gomphi, a Thessalian city, he had not only provisions for his army, but his men were unexpectedly relieved from their disease. For they fell in with abundance of wine, of which they drank plentifully, and reveling and rioting on their march, by means of their drunkenness, they threw off and got rid of their complaint in consequence of their bodies being brought into a different habit. 42. When the two armies had entered the plain of Farsalis and pitched their camps, Pompeius again fell back into his former opinion, and there were also unlucky appearances and a vision in his sleep. He dreamed that he saw himself in the theater, applauded by the Romans. But those about him were so confident and so fully anticipated a victory that Domitius and Scipio and Spinther were disputing and bestirring themselves against one another about the priesthood of Caesar, and many persons sent to Rome to hire and get possession of houses that were suitable for consuls and praetors, expecting to be elected to magistracies immediately after the war. But the cavalry showed most impatience for the battle, being sumptuously equipped with splendid armor, and priding themselves on their well-fed horses and fine persons, and on their numbers also, for they were 7,000 against Caesar's 1,000. The number of the infantry also was unequal, there being 45,000 matched against 22,000. 43. Caesar, calling his soldiers together and telling them that Corfinius was close at hand with 2 legions, and that other cohorts to the number of 15 under Calenus were encamped near Megara and Athens, asked if they would wait for them or hazard a battle by themselves. The soldiers cried out aloud that they did not wish him to wait, but rather to contrive and so manage his operations that they might soonest come to a battle with their enemies. While he was performing a lustration of the army, as soon as he had sacrificed the first victim, the soothsayer said that within 3 days there would be a decisive battle with the enemy. Upon Caesar asking him if he saw any favorable sign in the victims as to the result of the battle also, he replied, "You can answer this better for yourself. The gods indicate a great change and revolution of the actual state of things to a contrary state, so that if you think yourself prosperous in your present condition, expect the worst fortune. But if you do not, expect the better." As Caesar was taking his round to inspect the watches the night before the battle about midnight, there was seen in the heavens a fiery torch, which seemed to pass over Caesar's camp, and assuming a bright and flame-like appearance, to fall down upon the camp of Pompeius. In the morning watch they perceived that there was also a panic confusion among the enemy. However, as Caesar did not expect that the enemy would fight on that day, he began to break up his camp with the intention of marching to Scotossa. 44. The tents were already taken down when the scouts rode up to him with intelligence that the enemy were coming down to battle, whereupon Caesar was overjoyed. And after praying to the gods, he arranged his battle in 3 divisions. He placed Domitius Calvinus in command of the center, Antonius had the left wing, and he commanded the right, intending to fight in the 10th legion. Observing that the cavalry of the enemy were posting themselves opposite to this wing, and fearing their splendid appearance and their numbers, he ordered 6 cohorts to come round to him from the last line, without being observed, and he placed them in the rear of the right wing, with orders what to do when the enemy's cavalry made their attack. Pompeius commanded his own right, and Domitius the left, and the center was under Scipio, his father-in-law. But all the cavalry crowded to the left, intending to surround the right wing of the enemy, and to make a complete rout of the men who were stationed about the general. For they believed that no legionary phalanx, however deep, could resist, but that their opponents would be completely crushed and broken to pieces by an attack of so many cavalry at once. When the signal for attack was going to be given on both sides, Pompeius ordered the legionary soldiers to stand with their spears presented, and in close order, to wait the attack of the enemy, till they were within a spear's throw. But Caesar says that here also Pompeius made a mistake, not knowing that the first onset, accompanied with running and impetuosity, gives force to the blows, and at the same time fires the courage, which is thus fanned in every way. As Caesar was about to move his phalanx and was going into action, the first centurion that he spied was a man who was faithful to him and experienced in war, and was encouraging those under his command and urging them to vigorous exertion. Caesar, addressing him by name, said, "What hopes have we, Gaius Crescinius, and how are our men as to courage?" Crescinius, stretching out his right hand and calling out aloud, said, "We shall have a splendid victory, Caesar, and you shall praise me whether I survive the day or die." Saying this, he was the first to fall on the enemy at his full speed, and carrying with him the 120 soldiers who were under his command. Having cut through the first rank, he was advancing with great slaughter of the enemy, and was driving them from their ground, when he was stopped by a blow from a sword through the mouth, and the point came out at the back of his neck. 45. The infantry having thus rushed together in the center, and being engaged in the struggle, the cavalry of Pompeius proudly advanced from the wing, extending their companies to enclose Caesar's right. But before they fell upon the enemy, the cohort sprang forward from among Caesar's troops, not, according to the usual fashion of war, throwing their spears, nor yet them in their hands and aiming at the thighs and legs of the enemy, but pushing them against their eyes and wounding them in the face. And they had been instructed to do this by Caesar, who was confident that men who had no great familiarity with battles or wounds, and were young and very proud of their beauty and youth, would dread such wounds, and would not keep their ground both through fear of the present danger and the future disfigurement. And it turned out so, for they could not stand the spears being pushed up at them, nor did they venture to look at the iron that was presented against their eyes, but they turned away and covered their faces to save them. And at last, having thus thrown themselves into confusion, they turned to flight most disgracefully, and ruined the whole cause. For those who had defeated the cavalry immediately surrounded the infantry, and falling on them in the rear, began to cut them down. But when Pompeius saw from the other wing the cavalry dispersed in flight, he was no longer the same, nor did he recollect that he was Pompeius Magnus, but more like a man who was deprived of his understanding by the god than anything else. He retired, without speaking a word, to his tent, and sitting down awaited the result, until the rout becoming general, the enemy were assailing the ramparts, and fighting with those who defended them. Then, as if he had recovered his senses, and uttering only these words as it is reported, "What even to the ramparts?" he put off his military and general's dress, and taking one suited for a fugitive, stole away. But what fortunes he afterwards had, and how he gave himself up to the Egyptians and was murdered, I shall tell in the life of Pompeius. 46. When Caesar entered the camp of Pompeius and saw the bodies of those who were already killed, and the slaughter still going on among the living, he said with a groan, "They would have it so. They brought me into such a critical position that I, Gaius Caesar, who have been successful in the greatest wars, should have been condemned if I had disbanded my troops." Asinius Pollio says that Caesar uttered these words on that occasion in Latin, and that he wrote them down in Greek. He also says that the chief part of those who were killed were slaves, and they were killed when the camp was taken, and that not more than 6,000 soldiers fell. Of those who were taken prisoners, Caesar drafted most into his legions, and he pardoned many men of distinction, among whom was Brutus, who afterwards murdered him. Caesar is said to have been very much troubled at his not being found, but when Brutus, who had escaped unhurt, presented himself to Caesar, he was greatly pleased. 47. There were many prognostics of the victory, but the most remarkable is that which is reported as having appeared at Trailes. In the Temple of Victory there stood a statue of Caesar, and the ground about it was naturally firm, and the surface was also paved with hard stone. From this, they say, there sprung up a palm tree by the pedestal of the statue. In Patavium, Gaius Cornelius, a man who had reputation for his skill in divination, a fellow citizen and acquaintance of Livius the historian, happened to be sitting that day to watch the birds. And first of all, as Livius says, he discovered the time of the battle, and he said to those who were present that the affair was now deciding and the men were going into action. Looking again and observing the signs, he sprang up with enthusiasm and called out, "You conquer, Caesar!" The bystanders being surprised, he took the chaplet from his head and said with an oath that he would not put it on again till facts had confirmed his art. Livius affirms that these things were so.